1914. Miami was barely a town, a frontier settlement clinging to Florida's southeast coast, where swamps met the sea and mosquitoes outnumbered people. The entire city had fewer than 10,000 residents. Most streets were unpaved. The railroad had only arrived 18 years earlier. Into this tropical wilderness came James Deering, one of America's wealthiest bachelors with an impossible vision. He would build an Italian Renaissance palace. Not in Newport, where millionaires competed for social dominance. Not in New York, where Gilded Age fortunes built marble chateaux along Fifth Avenue. But here, in Miami's untamed jungle, on the edge of Biscayne Bay, where no one had attempted anything remotely like what he imagined. Vizcaya would take 8 years to complete. At its peak, construction employed 10% of Miami's entire population. European craftsmen arrived to execute decorative programs that belonged in Florentine palazzos, not Florida swampland. Antiques and architectural elements were shipped from Italy, France, and Spain, transplanted to a setting their original makers never could have imagined. James Deering would enjoy his creation for barely 5 years before death claimed him. The house that took nearly a decade to build was occupied by its creator for a fraction of that time. A bachelor's elaborate fantasy, completed just in time to become a brief, brilliant reality before fading into uncertainty. But Vizcaya survived. Through hurricanes that should have destroyed it, through decades of neglect and decay, through the tropical climate's relentless assault on European materials never designed for such conditions. The palace endures as testament to one man's determination to create beauty without compromise, regardless of logic, cost, or circumstance. This is the story of that determination, of wealth applied not to social competition, but to artistic vision. Of a millionaire who built not for dynasty or legacy, since he had neither wife nor children, but simply because he could imagine something extraordinary, and possessed the resources to make it real. James Deering's Vizcaya, an Italian dream rising from Miami's jungle, a bachelor's paradise that became a city's treasure. James Deering, the harvester fortune. James Deering never had to work for his fortune. He was born into it, the result of his father's genius for recognizing opportunity and his own skill at managing what he inherited. Born in 1859 in South Paris, Maine, James was the younger son of William Deering, a man who would transform American agriculture and build one of the great industrial fortunes of the Gilded Age. William started in the dry goods business but recognized that farming technology represented the future. He invested in the Marsh Harvester Company, eventually taking control and renaming it Deering Harvester Company. The business William built revolutionized grain harvesting. His machines allowed farmers to harvest exponentially more grain with less labor. As American agriculture expanded westward across the prairies, Deering harvesters followed. The company's success was tied directly to America's agricultural boom, and both grew together through the late 19th century. In 1902, William Deering merged his company with several competitors, including McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, to form International Harvester. The new corporation dominated agricultural equipment manufacturing. The merger made the Deering family extraordinarily wealthy. Contemporary sources suggest James's share of the family fortune exceeded $20 million, equivalent to well over $500 million today. James worked in the family business, holding executive positions at International Harvester, but his heart was never fully in industrial management. His older brother Charles handled most operational responsibilities. James attended board meetings, made decisions when required, but increasingly focused on other interests as his wealth made active management unnecessary. What truly engaged James was aesthetics. Art, architecture, music, beautiful objects. He traveled extensively in Europe, developing sophisticated taste and building knowledge of Renaissance and Baroque art and design. He collected paintings, sculptures, decorative arts. His education was that of a connoisseur, someone who could distinguish quality from mere expense. James never married. In an era when wealthy men were expected to establish dynasties, to marry appropriately, and produce heirs to inherit and manage family fortunes, James remained resolutely single. The reasons remain somewhat mysterious. Some contemporary accounts hint at relationships that never progressed to marriage. Others suggest he simply preferred independence, unwilling to accept the compromises marriage required. His bachelor status was unusual enough to generate speculation and gossip in Chicago society. Wealthy unmarried men were either suspected of hidden vices or pitied as somehow incomplete. But James had sufficient wealth and social position to ignore such pressures. He lived as he chose, accountable to no one but himself. By his early 50s, James had achieved everything conventional success demanded except a family. He had wealth beyond measure, social position, cultural refinement, a beautiful home in Chicago filled with art and antiques, respect in business circles despite his limited active involvement. Yet something was missing, though perhaps not what society imagined. James wanted to create something permanent. Not a business legacy, his brother Charles would handle that. Not a family dynasty, he had no children to inherit. But an artistic achievement that would outlast him. A place where everything he'd learned about beauty, design, and craftsmanship could be synthesized into physical form. He had the resources, he had the knowledge, he had the time, freed from business demands by his wealth. What he needed was the right location and the physical health to execute his vision. In 1912, James received news that would change everything. The diagnosis was tuberculosis, then one of the most feared diseases in America. The prescribed treatment was simple but absolute: warm, dry climate year-round. Chicago's winters, which James had endured for decades, were now potentially fatal. The disease that threatened his life would ultimately give him purpose. James Deering would need to leave Chicago, to find somewhere warm where he could breathe freely. And in that search for health, he would discover the place where his artistic vision could finally take physical form. The bachelor millionaire was about to meet his destiny in the most unlikely location imaginable. Not in Europe, where he'd studied beauty for decades. Not in established American cities where culture and sophistication already existed. But in Miami, a frontier town barely removed from wilderness, where nothing remotely like what he envisioned had ever been attempted. The diagnosis and discovery of Miami. Pernicious anemia in 1912 was a serious diagnosis, though not the death sentence it had been just decades earlier. For wealthy patients like James Deering, it meant fundamental changes to lifestyle, but with proper management, life could continue for years. The disease affected the blood's ability to produce healthy red blood cells, causing weakness, fatigue, and potentially severe complications if left untreated. Doctors understood that while the condition required ongoing medical attention, patients could maintain reasonable health through proper care and, crucially, the right environment. Medical advice for James was consistent: warm climate, sunshine, rest, and reduced stress. The condition thrived in cold, damp environments. Chicago's harsh winters were incompatible with managing pernicious anemia effectively. He needed to relocate somewhere warm year-round, where he could live comfortably while monitoring his health. The diagnosis forced James to reimagine his life entirely. He was in his early 50s, wealthy beyond measure, with sophisticated tastes developed through decades of European travel and collecting. Now he needed to find somewhere warm where he could maintain the lifestyle his education and resources supported. But where? California was popular with wealthy patients seeking warm climate, but it felt too far from the East Coast connections that still mattered. The Southwest offered dry heat, but little culture or society. Florida presented an intriguing possibility: warm year-round, accessible from the East Coast, developing rapidly. But Florida, in 1912, was still largely frontier. Most of the state was swamp, jungle, or undeveloped coastline. James visited Miami around 1912 to assess its potential. What he found was barely recognizable as urban. The town had incorporated only 16 years earlier, in 1896. The population was still modest, somewhere around 5,000 year-round residents, swelling slightly during winter months when northerners escaped cold weather. Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway had reached Miami in 1896, making the town accessible but not yet civilized. The streets were mostly unpaved. Buildings were predominantly wood construction, simple structures designed for tropical climate rather than architectural statement. There were a few hotels catering to winter visitors, a modest downtown district, but nothing approaching the urban sophistication James knew from Chicago, New York, or European cities. What Miami offered instead was untamed natural beauty. Biscayne Bay stretched azure and pristine. Tropical vegetation grew with aggressive intensity. The climate was warm year-round, humid rather than dry, but certainly better than Chicago winters. And land was available. Vast stretches of undeveloped coastline where someone with vision and resources could create something unprecedented. James recognized opportunity. Miami's lack of development wasn't a drawback, it was freedom. In Newport or Palm Beach, he'd be building among established wealth, his house compared to existing mansions. But in Miami, he could be first. He could establish standards rather than competing with them. The raw landscape offered a blank canvas where his vision could take form without constraint. He began acquiring property along Biscayne Bay, south of Miami's modest downtown. The site was spectacular, waterfront land with views across the bay, but it was also wilderness, mangrove swamps, dense tropical jungle, the kind of terrain that required serious effort to make buildable. Most people would have seen obstacles. James saw possibilities. The contrast between what existed and what he envisioned was extreme. Miami in 1912 was a frontier outpost with limited infrastructure, few skilled workers, and no tradition of sophisticated architecture. James intended to build an Italian Renaissance villa with European craftsmanship, imported materials, and artistic programs rivaling anything in Newport or Long Island's Gold Coast. The challenge was enormous. Everything would need to be imported or created from scratch. Skilled craftsmen would need to be brought from Europe or the North. Materials would need to be shipped from distant sources. The very concept of building a Renaissance palazzo in tropical wilderness seemed absurd by conventional standards. But James had advantages beyond wealth. His pernicious anemia diagnosis, while serious, had freed him from business obligations. He could devote years to this project without worrying about other demands on his time. His bachelor status meant no wife questioning the wisdom of building a palace in a swamp, no children whose inheritance might be squandered on architectural fantasy. Miami around 1912 was experiencing early signs of the boom that would transform it over the next decade. Real estate speculators were arriving. Northern money was beginning to recognize Florida's potential. Carl Fisher was starting to develop Miami Beach across the bay. The city was poised for explosive growth, though few recognized it yet. James's timing was perfect. He arrived early enough to acquire prime waterfront property at reasonable cost. He came with resources that could accelerate Miami's development through his construction project. And he brought sophistication that would raise the city's cultural ambitions, demonstrating that serious architecture was possible even in this frontier setting. The diagnosis that had disrupted his life was becoming the catalyst for his greatest achievement. James Deering would create something unprecedented in Miami's wilderness, an Italian villa rising from tropical jungle, a Renaissance palace on Biscayne Bay, a bachelor's dream made real through wealth, vision, and the determination that comes from knowing health might be fragile. He had found his location. Now he needed to assemble the team that could transform vision into reality. The site was acquired. The concept was forming. What James needed was an architect who could understand his European aesthetic and adapt it to tropical conditions, and designers who could execute interiors rivaling anything in Italy or France. The search for that team would lead James to exactly the right collaborators. Men who shared his artistic ambitions and possessed the technical skill to build Renaissance splendor in Florida's unforgiving climate. The vision takes shape, an Italian villa in the tropics. James Deering knew exactly what he didn't want. He didn't want a tropical bungalow, the common approach to Florida architecture. He didn't want Spanish colonial revival, though that style was becoming fashionable in the South. and he certainly didn't want anything resembling the wooden structures that passed for architecture in Miami. He wanted an Italian Renaissance villa, the kind of palazzo he'd studied for decades in Florence, Rome, and Venice. Stone construction with elaborate decorative programs, formal rooms arranged around courtyards, gardens that extended architecture into landscape, the integration of art, architecture, and nature that characterized the greatest Italian country estates. The vision was audacious for multiple reasons. Italian villas were designed for Mediterranean climate, with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. South Florida offered hot, humid summers and warm, humid winters, with tropical storms that Mediterranean buildings never needed to withstand. The materials that worked perfectly in Italy, limestone, stucco, terracotta, faced very different conditions in Miami's aggressive climate. But James wasn't deterred by practical considerations. He'd spent years developing his aesthetic education. He knew what great architecture looked like, how it functioned, why it succeeded. His vision for Vizcaya, the name he'd chosen from Spanish, wasn't about compromise or adaptation. It was about creating authentic Renaissance quality regardless of location or climate challenges. The concept evolved through conversations with architects and designers, but the core vision remained James's. The house would face Biscayne Bay, with principal rooms oriented to capture views and breezes. It would be organized around a central courtyard in proper Italian fashion, providing both circulation and outdoor living space protected from the elements. The architecture would be villa rather than palazzo, substantial but not overwhelming, designed for a bachelor's comfortable living rather than dynastic representation. Scale was carefully considered. James didn't want the largest house in America. He wanted the most beautiful, the most refined, the most authentically Italian. The house would be large enough for proper entertaining and displaying his collections, but intimate enough to function as a comfortable residence for a single man and his guests. The exterior would follow Italian Renaissance precedent: stone on the lower floors, stucco above. A loggia providing shaded outdoor space overlooking the bay. Balconies and terraces integrating interior and exterior. The roofline would be relatively low and horizontal, unlike the vertical emphasis of Newport mansions, because Italian villas spread rather than soared. James envisioned the house set within elaborate formal gardens, not tropical landscaping, which would have been appropriate to location, but European formal gardens adapted to Florida conditions. Parterres, fountains, sculpture, architectural elements. The gardens would demonstrate the same commitment to European aesthetic that governed the house itself. The interiors would showcase James's collecting, rooms designed around specific pieces with ceiling heights, proportions, and decorative programs that complemented rather than competed with furnishings and art. This wasn't a house where architecture overwhelmed contents. It was an environment where architecture, decoration, and collections formed unified artistic statements. James wanted authentic materials throughout: Italian marble, not domestic substitutes; European antique furniture, not reproductions; architectural elements salvaged from actual Renaissance buildings when possible, giving Vizcaya the patina of age rather than the rawness of new construction. The house should feel like it had evolved over centuries, even though it would be built in less than a decade. The technical challenges of executing this vision in Miami were substantial. Stone needed to be imported. There were no local quarries producing appropriate material. Craftsmen capable of executing Renaissance-quality decorative programs didn't exist in Miami. They'd need to be brought from Europe or northern cities. Even basic construction materials and methods required rethinking for tropical conditions. But James had one overwhelming advantage: money. International harvester dividends provided essentially unlimited resources. He could afford to ship materials from anywhere. He could pay European craftsmen whatever was necessary to relocate temporarily to Miami. He could experiment with construction techniques until finding approaches that worked in tropical climate. The vision taking shape in James's mind was nothing less than transplanting Italian Renaissance architecture wholesale to Florida. Not adapting it, not compromising it, but creating the real thing in the wrong location through sheer determination and financial resources. It was the kind of vision only enormous wealth made conceivable, and only sophisticated aesthetic education made desirable. Early sketches began translating concept into architectural form. The house would be organized around a central courtyard. The water-facing side would have the loggia and principal rooms. The land-facing side would be more formal, the official entrance through which guests would arrive. Service spaces would be discreetly separated, allowing the bachelor lifestyle James wanted while supporting the elaborate entertaining the house would accommodate. James was designing not just a residence but a complete environment. The house, gardens, and waterfront would form an integrated composition where architecture mediated between European cultural tradition and tropical natural setting. It was an impossible vision by conventional standards, which made it exactly the kind of challenge James's wealth, education, and determination were suited to overcome. He had the site. He had the vision. Now he needed the team who could make it real. The search for an architect and designers capable of executing this impossible dream would determine whether Vizcaya became a masterpiece or merely an expensive folly. Assembling the team, Hoffman and Suarez. James Deering needed collaborators who could match his vision. Building an Italian Renaissance villa in tropical Miami required more than conventional architects. He needed artists who understood European precedent and possessed the creativity to adapt it to unprecedented circumstances. The search led him to two men whose combined talents would make Vizcaya possible: F. Burrell Hoffman Jr. as architect and Diego Suarez as landscape designer. But the story of Vizcaya's creative team was more complex than simple professional relationships. At the center was Paul Chalfin, who would become James's closest collaborator and the visionary mastermind behind the entire project. Paul Chalfin was an unusual figure in early 20th century design. He'd studied at Harvard, then trained as a painter at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, absorbing the same rigorous classical education that shaped the best European architects. But Chalfin's interests extended beyond painting to encompass all aspects of design: architecture, interiors, decorative arts, landscape. He was a connoisseur rather than a specialist, someone who understood how all elements should work together to create unified artistic environments. Chalfin had connections to Elsie de Wolfe, the pioneering interior decorator who was transforming how wealthy Americans thought about their homes. Through de Wolfe, Chalfin met James Deering in 1910, initially hired to work on interiors for James's Chicago residence. The two men discovered immediate rapport. Both had studied in Europe. Both understood that creating great houses required more than assembling expensive objects. Both believed American wealth could support European artistic standards if guided by educated taste. In 1910, shortly after meeting, Chalfin and Deering embarked on the first of what would become many European trips together. They weren't simply touring as wealthy Americans often did. They were researching, acquiring knowledge and objects that would eventually inform Vizcaya. They visited Renaissance villas, studied garden designs, met with dealers and craftsmen, purchased architectural elements and furnishings. These trips were working expeditions, building the intellectual and material foundation for the Florida project. Chalfin's role evolved beyond decorator or advisor. He became the project's artistic director, the person who would translate James's general vision into specific architectural and decorative decisions. James provided the resources and overall aesthetic direction. Chalfin provided the expertise to execute that vision at the highest level. For the architecture itself, Chalfin recommended F. Burrell Hoffman Jr. Hoffman came from established New York architectural circles, trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition that emphasized classical forms and comprehensive design thinking. He'd worked on substantial residential projects and understood how to create houses that functioned as both comfortable residences and artistic statements. Hoffman was younger than James, in his 30s when the Vizcaya project began, but he possessed the technical knowledge necessary to tackle the unique challenges of building in South Florida. The climate was unlike anything in Europe or the American North. High humidity, intense heat, tropical storms, the very soil and vegetation were hostile to European architectural traditions. Hoffman would need to adapt Renaissance forms to function in conditions their original creators never imagined. The collaboration between Chalfin and Hoffman was essential to Vizcaya's success. Chalfin understood the artistic vision, what the house should feel like, how it should relate to European precedents. Hoffman understood structural systems, building materials, construction techniques. Neither could have created Vizcaya alone. Together, with James's guidance and resources, they could attempt the impossible. For the landscape, Chalfin brought in Diego Suarez, a Colombian landscape designer with sophisticated understanding of formal garden design. Suarez faced perhaps the most daunting challenge of the entire team. European formal gardens were designed for temperate climates with distinct seasons. South Florida offered relentless heat, humidity, tropical storms, and vegetation that grew with aggressive intensity. Suarez would need to create gardens that looked European, with parterres, fountains, sculpture, and architectural elements, while using tropical plants that could survive Florida conditions. The conceptual tension was extreme, imposing rigid, formal geometry on a landscape that naturally tended toward exuberant chaos. The team assembled around James Deering represented an unusual combination of talents: Chalfin as visionary coordinator, Hoffman as practical architect, Suarez as landscape designer, and James himself as patron, providing not just money but educated judgment about artistic decisions. This wasn't a typical architect-client relationship where the patron simply approved designs. James was actively involved, his European education and collecting experience making him a genuine collaborator rather than passive consumer. The European trips continued through the early 1910s. Each journey brought back more objects, architectural fragments, antique furniture, decorative elements, entire room paneling that would be incorporated into Vizcaya's design. They were building the house before construction began, accumulating the materials and objects that would give it authenticity, rather than simply creating a new building decorated with purchased antiques. This approach distinguished Vizcaya from many contemporary American mansions. Houses like the Breakers in Newport were designed first, then furnished. Vizcaya was being conceived as a total work of art, where architecture, interiors, furnishings, and landscape evolved together. The process was slower and more complex, but the result would be more coherent. By 1914, the team was ready to begin actual construction. They'd spent 4 years planning, researching, and acquiring. The site was prepared. The designs were developed. The materials were being assembled. James had his collaborators, each bringing essential expertise to an unprecedented project. The relationship between James and his design team, particularly Chalfin, was intimate in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. They traveled together for years, made decisions together, shared a vision of what Vizcaya could become. For James, a lifelong bachelor, these working relationships provided companionship and shared purpose that family life might have offered others. Chalfin understood James in ways few others did. He recognized that Vizcaya wasn't just about creating a beautiful house. It was about giving physical form to everything James had learned about art, architecture, and beauty during his decades of European travel. It was about creating something permanent that would outlast its creator. For a man with no children, Vizcaya would be his legacy. The team that assembled around James Deering in the early 1910s was uniquely suited to the challenge ahead. Hoffman had the architectural skill. Suarez had the landscape expertise. Chalfin had the artistic vision and the personal relationship with James that allowed genuine creative collaboration. Together, they would spend the next 8 years building something that shouldn't have been possible: an authentic Italian Renaissance villa rising from Miami's tropical wilderness. Construction would begin soon. The wilderness would be tamed. The vision that had evolved through years of planning and accumulation would finally take physical form on Biscayne Bay, the European acquisition, buying a Renaissance. James Deering and Paul Chalfin weren't simply building a new house and decorating it with European antiques. They were attempting something far more ambitious: transplanting actual Renaissance and Baroque architecture to Florida. The acquisition expeditions that began in 1910 continued through the mid-1910s, even as construction was underway in Miami. Chalfin and Deering traveled through Italy, France, and Spain, searching for architectural elements, decorative objects, and furnishings that could be incorporated into Vizcaya's design. These weren't shopping trips in any conventional sense. They were rescue missions, saving fragments of European cultural heritage and giving them new life in America. Europe in the early 20th century offered unprecedented opportunities for wealthy American collectors. Old aristocratic families facing economic pressures were selling estates and dispersing collections. Buildings were being demolished or remodeled, making architectural elements available. Wars and political upheaval created situations where objects could be acquired that might have been unavailable during more stable times. Chalfin had developed relationships with dealers, craftsmen, and intermediaries throughout Europe. He knew which Venetian dealer had access to Renaissance stone columns, which Florentine workshop could provide authentic period ironwork, which French chateau was being dismantled and might sell its carved wood paneling. This network was essential to acquiring the quality and authenticity James demanded. The philosophy behind their acquisitions was sophisticated. They weren't simply buying the most expensive or impressive objects. They were selecting pieces that would work together, that shared aesthetic qualities even if they came from different periods or regions. A 16th century Italian ceiling could coexist with 18th century French furniture if both expressed the classical tradition and similar standards of craftsmanship. Architectural elements were particularly important. Stone columns that had stood in Renaissance buildings, carved marble doorways and window surrounds, elaborate ceiling beams with original painted decoration, iron gates and balcony railings. These weren't reproductions or inspired by pieces. They were the real thing, removed from European buildings and shipped to Miami to be incorporated into Vizcaya's structure. The process of acquisition required patience and expertise. A promising lead about available architectural elements might require weeks of investigation, examining pieces to verify authenticity and quality, negotiating prices with dealers or directly with property owners, arranging transportation from remote Italian villages or French provincial estates to ports, then across the Atlantic to Miami. Some acquisitions were entire rooms, ceiling programs complete with carved and painted decoration, wall paneling that had lined aristocratic apartments. These would be carefully documented, disassembled, crated, and shipped. At Vizcaya, they would be reinstalled, sometimes adapted to fit the new architecture, but preserving their essential character and craftsmanship. Furniture received equal attention. James and Chalfin sought pieces that combined quality, authenticity, and appropriateness for Vizcaya's rooms. Renaissance cassoni, elaborate carved chests, Baroque tables and chairs, French commodes and cabinets. Each piece was evaluated not just for its individual merit, but for how it would function within the larger decorative programs being planned. The decorative arts collection grew to include ceramics, textiles, sculpture, paintings, and countless smaller objects. Italian majolica, Spanish leather wall coverings, Flemish tapestries. These objects would give Vizcaya the density and richness of European interiors, where every surface held something beautiful to contemplate. Chalfin was building a collection that served multiple purposes. The objects needed to be authentic and beautiful, satisfying James's educated taste. They needed to function within the house, providing appropriate furnishings for daily life and entertaining. And they needed to work together aesthetically, creating environments that felt coherent rather than random assemblages of expensive things. The scale of acquisition was enormous. Shipping manifests documented hundreds of crates arriving in Miami throughout the construction period. Some contained large architectural elements. Others held carefully packed furniture and decorative objects. The logistics of tracking, storing, and eventually installing all these pieces required sophisticated organization. The financial commitment was staggering even by James's standards. Contemporary estimates suggested the acquisitions alone cost well over $1 million, separate from construction expenses. Each European trip involved not just purchase prices, but also transportation, customs, expert fees, and the costs of maintaining the network of dealers and intermediaries who made the acquisitions possible. But James wasn't concerned with expense. He had resources that made cost nearly irrelevant. What mattered was quality and authenticity. If an architectural element was perfect for Vizcaya, the price was secondary. This freedom allowed Chalfin to pursue acquisitions that other collectors might have reluctantly declined as too expensive. The approach to acquisition reflected broader principles about what Vizcaya should be. The house wasn't meant to look new and expensive. It should feel like it had evolved over time, like a European villa that had been inhabited and enriched by multiple generations. The weathered stone, the antique furniture, the architectural elements with centuries of patina all contributed to this sense of accumulated history. There was irony in this approach. Vizcaya was being built in a location with almost no European history. Miami in the 1910s was frontier, barely removed from wilderness. Yet James and Chalfin were creating a house saturated with European cultural tradition, physically incorporating fragments of that tradition into a new building thousands of miles from their origins. The acquisitions also reflected James's understanding that he was creating something that would outlast him. A bachelor with no direct heirs, he was building not for dynasty but for posterity. The objects he and Chalfin selected weren't just furnishings for his lifetime. They were cultural artifacts that would remain at Vizcaya, telling stories about European craftsmanship and American collecting ambitions long after their original purposes were forgotten. By the time construction was substantially complete in the early 1920s, Vizcaya contained one of the most significant collections of European decorative arts in America. Not as large as some museum collections, but arguably more coherent, because every piece had been selected to function within a specific architectural context. The house and its contents formed an integrated whole, each element enhancing the others. The European acquisition project demonstrated what unlimited resources combined with educated taste could achieve. James and Chalfin had literally bought pieces of European cultural heritage and reassembled them in Florida. The result wasn't simply an expensive house filled with expensive things. It was a sophisticated artistic statement about the relationship between European tradition and American ambition, executed with the quality that only authentic objects and materials could provide. The wilderness site at Biscayne Bay was ready. The architectural elements were acquired. The furnishings were crated and waiting. Now the real work could begin, transforming vision and accumulated materials into actual architecture rising from the tropical landscape. The site, Taming the Wilderness. The property James Deering acquired along Biscayne Bay was spectacular in its natural beauty and daunting in its wildness. What would become Vizcaya's formal gardens and Renaissance architecture was, in 1914, dense tropical jungle, mangrove swamps, and untamed coastline. The site encompassed over 100 acres stretching from the bay inland. The waterfront offered stunning views across Biscayne Bay, but accessing that view required clearing vegetation so dense that visibility extended only a few feet in any direction. Mangroves dominated the shoreline, their complex root systems creating barriers between land and water. Inland, hardwood hammock and tropical growth formed an almost impenetrable tangle. Site preparation for Vizcaya required transforming this wilderness into buildable land while preserving enough natural beauty to create the impression of an estate that had evolved gradually within its landscape. The work was more complex than simple clearing. It required understanding the site's ecology, managing water levels, creating stable foundations in unstable soil, and establishing the infrastructure that would allow European-style architecture to survive in tropical conditions. The first challenge was water. South Florida's water table was extremely high, often just inches below the surface. The land was naturally marshy, becoming completely flooded during the wet season. Building substantial stone architecture required raising the elevation and managing drainage to prevent the house from literally sinking into the swamp. Engineers developed an extensive drainage system. Canals were cut to channel water away from the building site. Fill was brought in to raise the elevation where the house and formal gardens would be located. The work was labor-intensive and slow, requiring teams of workers with hand tools to move earth and stone in an era before modern heavy equipment. The mangroves presented their own challenges. These salt-tolerant trees formed dense thickets along the waterfront. their root systems binding the soil and creating natural barriers. Clearing them was necessary for creating the formal relationship between house and bay that the design required, but it also risked destabilizing the shoreline. The work had to be done carefully, removing enough to create views and access while leaving sufficient vegetation to prevent erosion. The native tropical vegetation was simultaneously an obstacle and an asset. The dense growth needed to be cleared from building sites and formal garden areas. But mature trees, particularly the live oaks that gave the property character, were preserved wherever possible. These trees provided immediate maturity to the landscape, making Vizcaya feel established rather than raw and new. Hoffman and Suarez worked together to determine which areas would be completely cleared for formal gardens and which would remain as naturalistic landscape. The vision wasn't to eliminate all tropical character. The formal gardens immediately around the house would be rigorously European, but beyond them, a more naturalistic zone would transition gradually to preserved native hammock. This gradation from formal to natural was essential to Vizcaya's relationship with its site. The soil itself was problematic for European garden plants. South Florida's sandy, alkaline soil was nothing like the rich loam of European estates. Imported topsoil was brought in for garden areas where Suarez would attempt to grow plants more accustomed to Mediterranean conditions. The expense was enormous, but necessary if formal gardens were to succeed. Rock for construction presented opportunities and challenges. While South Florida lacked the granite and limestone quarries that served northern building projects, it had abundant coral rock. This porous stone, formed from ancient coral reefs, could be quarried locally and worked relatively easily. It became a principal building material for walls, foundations, and landscape features. The stone's porosity was problematic in some applications, but it provided authentic texture and color that imported stone couldn't match. Access to the site was limited. A rough road connected the property to Miami's modest downtown, but it was barely adequate for the traffic that construction would generate. Improvements were necessary to allow materials, equipment, and workers to reach the site. Much material came by water, with boats and barges delivering shipments to a temporary dock constructed on the bay. The coastline required engineering to create the formal relationship between house and water that the design demanded. A seawall was constructed to define the edge between land and bay, replacing the natural mangrove shoreline with architectural form. This allowed the creation of the stone barge, the famous breakwater designed as a sculptural element that would become one of Vizcaya's most recognizable features. Site work employed hundreds of workers, many of them recent migrants to Miami seeking employment. The work was physically demanding, often in brutal heat and humidity. Clearing jungle with hand tools, moving fill, excavating foundations, constructing drainage systems, all required sustained manual labor. For many workers, this was their introduction to the massive construction project that would soon dominate Miami's economy. The scale of site transformation was unprecedented in South Florida. No previous project had attempted anything remotely similar. Converting over 100 acres of wilderness into a formal estate with extensive gardens, multiple buildings, and all the infrastructure required to support them. The work took months before actual building construction could even begin. As the site was prepared, its relationship to the larger Miami context became apparent. The property was both connected to and separated from the developing city. Close enough to access urban services and transportation, but removed enough to feel like a private domain. The site's scale created its own world, a self-contained estate where European aesthetic could be imposed on tropical reality. By late 1914, the site was ready for construction. The wilderness had been tamed, though not eliminated. Water was controlled. The building location was established and elevated. Access roads and docks were functional. The relationship between formal and naturalistic landscape was defined. The transformation from impenetrable jungle to buildable estate had required enormous effort and expense, but it created the foundation for everything that would follow. James Deering had his site prepared. Hoffman had his design ready. Chalfin had accumulated the architectural elements and furnishings. The team of craftsmen was assembling. The actual construction of Vizcaya could finally begin, transforming vision and accumulated materials into Renaissance architecture, rising improbably from the tropical shore of Biscayne Bay. Building Vizcaya, construction in paradise. Construction began in earnest in 1914, transforming the cleared site into one of the most ambitious building projects Florida had ever seen. What James Deering and his team were attempting had no precedent, creating an Italian Renaissance villa using European craftsmanship and materials in a tropical environment that challenged every assumption about how such buildings should be constructed. F. Burrell Hoffman's architectural challenge was immediate and fundamental. Italian villas were designed for Mediterranean climate with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. South Florida offered relentless heat and humidity year-round, tropical storms with wind speeds that Mediterranean buildings never needed to withstand, and soil conditions completely unlike anything in Europe. Every design decision required rethinking traditional approaches. The structural system relied on reinforced concrete, a relatively modern material that offered advantages for tropical construction. Unlike wood, which rotted quickly in Florida's humidity, or traditional masonry, which required massive walls for stability, reinforced concrete could create the spans and heights Hoffman's design required, while resisting the climate's destructive effects. Steel reinforcing bars were embedded in concrete to create a framework that could support the building's mass and resist hurricane winds. The exterior walls combined multiple materials to achieve the appearance Deering wanted while functioning in tropical conditions. The lower floors used coral stone, quarried locally and from Cuba, providing authentic texture and the weathered appearance of aged Italian villas. The upper floors were finished with stucco over concrete, detailed to suggest traditional masonry construction while actually functioning as modern building technology hidden behind historical appearance. The roof presented particular challenges. Italian villas typically used clay tile, but Florida's hurricane winds would tear traditional tile installations apart. Hoffman's team developed mounting systems that secured tiles more firmly while maintaining the authentic appearance Deering demanded. The roof structure itself was reinforced concrete rather than traditional timber framing, providing strength to resist wind loads that would have destroyed conventional construction. Windows were larger and more numerous than typical Italian precedent would suggest. This wasn't stylistic choice but practical necessity. Natural ventilation was essential in an era before effective air conditioning. The house needed cross breezes to remain livable during Florida's oppressive summer heat. Hoffman designed window placement to capture prevailing winds, creating airflow through principal rooms while maintaining the formal appearance Renaissance architecture demanded. The workforce assembled for Vizcaya's construction was as international as the materials and design. Italian stonemasons brought expertise in carving and setting stone that local workers lacked. Bahamian craftsmen, experienced with coral stone and tropical construction, contributed essential knowledge about working with local materials in humid conditions. German and Czech artisans executed decorative plasterwork and carved details. Scottish craftsmen handled ironwork. The site became a Tower of Babel. Multiple languages spoken as workers from different traditions collaborated on a building that synthesized their various skills. At peak construction, approximately 1,000 workers were employed on various aspects of the project. For Miami, with a total population around 10,000, this represented an extraordinary economic impact. 10% of the city's entire population was working on one house. Wages flowed into the local economy. Boarding houses filled with workers. Merchants sold supplies. Miami's growth in the 1910s was substantially driven by Vizcaya's construction. The scale of material procurement was staggering. Stone came from local quarries, Cuba, and Europe. Timber for forms and temporary structures came from the American South. Steel reinforcing arrived by rail from northern mills. Decorative materials, the antique architectural elements, carved mantels, historic paneling, came from Europe in hundreds of crated shipments. Coordinating delivery of all these materials to a site with limited transportation infrastructure required sophisticated logistics. The construction timeline was compressed by James's health concerns and his desire to occupy the house as soon as possible. Letters between Deering, Hoffman, and Chalfin reveal constant pressure to accelerate work while maintaining the quality standards the design demanded. The tension between speed and excellence created stress throughout the project, but also drove remarkable productivity. World War I, beginning in 1914, just as construction started, complicated everything. Materials became difficult to source as European production shifted to war needs. Skilled craftsmen, particularly those from Europe, faced travel restrictions and divided loyalties. Some workers returned to their home countries to serve in the military. The war didn't stop Vizcaya's construction, but it slowed progress and forced improvisation when preferred materials or craftsmen weren't available. By late 1916, enough of the house was complete that James could take occupancy. He arrived on Christmas Day, 1916, aboard his yacht Nepenthe, greeted by cannon fire in a theatrical arrival that marked Vizcaya's transition from construction site to functioning residence. But construction continued around him for several more years. Living in an active construction site must have been uncomfortable, but James's eagerness to enjoy his creation outweighed the inconvenience. The interiors were the most complex aspect of construction, requiring coordination of multiple trades and integration of the antique elements Chalfin and Deering had collected. Historic ceiling beams needed to be adapted to fit modern concrete structure. Antique door and window surrounds had to be incorporated into new walls. Marble floors were laid using both historic salvaged pieces and new stone cut to match. Every room became a puzzle of integrating old and new. Chalfin oversaw the interior work with obsessive attention to detail. He understood that the difference between an expensive new house filled with antiques and an authentic-feeling villa lay in hundreds of subtle decisions about how elements were combined. Nothing could look obviously new. Even new work needed to feel like it had been there for centuries, achieved through careful selection of materials, finishes that suggested age, and placement that felt organic rather than staged. The decorative painting programs required specialist artists working for months on individual ceilings and walls. Some decorative elements were salvaged from European buildings and reinstalled at Vizcaya. Others were executed on site by craftsmen working in traditional techniques, creating new decoration that matched the quality and style of historic work. The goal throughout was seamlessness, making it impossible to distinguish what was genuinely old from what was created new for the house. Modern building systems were concealed throughout. Electrical wiring ran hidden in walls and ceilings. Plumbing for the numerous bathrooms was installed behind finished surfaces. A central heating system, unusual for Florida, but necessary for occasional cold weather and maintaining comfortable humidity levels, was incorporated invisibly. Vizcaya had modern conveniences including elevators, a vacuum cleaning system, and one of Miami's first telephone systems, all integrated so carefully that they didn't compromise the historical atmosphere Deering wanted. The construction represented a technological achievement as significant as its artistic success. Building European-style architecture in tropical conditions required solving problems that had no established solutions. Hoffman and his team were inventing as they went, developing techniques that would influence Florida construction for decades. The successful completion of Vizcaya demonstrated that sophisticated architecture could survive and function in South Florida's challenging environment. By 1922, the villa was substantially complete, though finishing work and adjustments continued. What had risen from the tropical wilderness was extraordinary. A Renaissance palazzo that looked like it had stood for centuries, functioning with modern convenience, surviving in a climate that should have made such architecture impossible. The construction phase of Vizcaya had employed thousands, injected millions into Miami's economy, and created something unprecedented in American architecture. James Deering had his villa. The vision that had evolved through years of planning and collecting had taken physical form. Now the focus would shift from construction to completion of the gardens and, most importantly, to living in and enjoying the extraordinary environment he'd created. 10% of Miami, the local economic impact. Vizcaya didn't just change one property on Biscayne Bay, it transformed Miami itself, demonstrating what the city could become and injecting resources that accelerated its evolution from frontier town to substantial urban center. The employment numbers alone were transformative. At peak construction, approximately 1,000 men worked on various aspects of Vizcaya. Miami's total population in the mid-1910s was around 10,000. Simple mathematics reveals the scale. 1 in 10 Miami residents was earning wages from a single construction project. No other single employer came close to this impact. The wages were substantial by local standards. Skilled craftsmen, particularly those brought from Europe or the American North, commanded premium pay. Even unskilled laborers earned steady income that supported families and generated spending throughout the local economy. Money that James Deering paid for construction didn't stay at Vizcaya. It flowed through Miami, supporting grocers, boarding houses, merchants, and countless other businesses. The workforce composition reflected Miami's developing diversity. Bahamian workers, many of whom had migrated to South Florida, seeking employment, formed a significant portion of the labor force. Their expertise with coral, stone, and tropical construction was essential, and Vizcaya employment provided economic stability for Miami's growing Bahamian community. Black workers, whether Bahamian or American, faced discrimination in many sectors but found relatively steady employment on the Vizcaya project, though likely at lower wages than white workers with comparable skills. European craftsmen who came specifically for Vizcaya introduced skills and techniques that didn't previously exist in Miami. Italian stonemasons demonstrated traditional methods for working marble and stone. German and Czech artisans brought decorative plasterwork expertise. These craftsmen didn't just complete Vizcaya and leave. Many stayed in Miami after the project, establishing businesses and training local workers. Vizcaya became an informal school for skilled trades, raising the general level of craftsmanship available in the city. The supply chain impact extended far beyond direct employment. Local quarries sold coral stone. Lumber yards supplied timber for forms and temporary structures. Hardware merchants sold tools and supplies. Transportation companies moved materials from ports and rail yards to the construction site. Every aspect of Vizcaya's construction generated business for Miami enterprises. The project's duration, spanning roughly 8 years from initial site work through completion, provided economic stability through a period of significant change. World War I disrupted many aspects of American economy, but Vizcaya construction continued, offering employment when other work might have been scarce. The project helped Miami weather economic uncertainty that affected much of the nation. Real estate development accelerated partly due to Vizcaya's demonstration effect. James Deering had proven that wealthy individuals would invest substantial resources in Miami property. If one millionaire could build an Italian villa, others might follow with their own grand estates. The psychological impact on Miami's self-image was significant. The city was no longer just a frontier outpost. It was a place where serious architecture and sophisticated wealth were choosing to establish themselves. The construction also drove infrastructure improvements. The rough road connecting Vizcaya to downtown Miami was upgraded to handle construction traffic. Dock facilities at the site improved to receive shipments arriving by water. These improvements benefited the surrounding area long after Vizcaya's construction was complete. Local businesses adapted to serve the project. Specialized suppliers who might not have existed in Miami before Vizcaya found it worthwhile to establish operations to serve the construction. These businesses then remained, providing services and materials for subsequent development. Vizcaya effectively seeded Miami with capabilities that supported the city's growth through the 1920s boom. The social impact was complex. Vizcaya's employment provided opportunity, but it also highlighted inequalities. European craftsmen earned far more than local workers doing comparable physical labor. White workers had access to better positions and higher pay than black workers with similar skills. The project reproduced the racial and ethnic hierarchies of early 20th century America, even as it provided economic benefit across communities. For Miami's black community, including both American and Bahamian workers, Vizcaya employment was economically significant despite discriminatory wage structures. Steady work at any wage helped families establish themselves, save money, and create foundations for future opportunities. The wages earned by black workers on Vizcaya contributed to the growth of Miami's black neighborhoods and businesses. The completion of Vizcaya changed perceptions of what Miami could be. Visitors who toured the estate, either as James's guests or later as museum visitors, saw evidence that sophisticated culture could exist in South Florida. This helped attract subsequent waves of wealthy residents and tourists who might otherwise have dismissed Miami as too primitive or undeveloped for their consideration. The project's scale also trained a generation of workers in sophisticated construction techniques. Men who learned skilled trades on Vizcaya carried that knowledge to subsequent projects. Miami's building boom in the 1920s benefited directly from the workforce Vizcaya had trained. The city had a pool of workers with experience in high-quality construction that wouldn't have existed without the Deering project. Local pride in Vizcaya developed quickly. Miami residents understood they'd been part of creating something extraordinary. The house became a talking point, evidence that their small city could support world-class architecture. This pride contributed to Miami's self-confidence as it grew rapidly through the 1920s. The economic multiplier effects continued long after construction ended. Vizcaya required permanent staff for maintenance, gardening, household operations. James Deering's winter residence supported dozens of year-round positions, providing stable employment that had spillover effects throughout the local economy. When James entertained guests, local merchants benefited from supplying food, wine, and services for elaborate parties. The transformation of Miami from frontier town to substantial city had many causes, but Vizcaya was among the most visible. The project demonstrated that Miami could attract serious wealth and support sophisticated development. It trained workers, established businesses, improved infrastructure, and changed how people thought about the city's possibilities. James Deering had built his villa, but in doing so, he'd helped build modern Miami. The 10% of the city's population working on Vizcaya weren't just constructing a house. They were constructing the foundation for the city's future growth, proving that Miami could be more than a small frontier settlement. The impact of those years of construction would echo through Miami's development for decades, long after James's death and Vizcaya's transformation from private estate to public museum. The Gardens. Formal European design meets Florida. Diego Suarez faced an impossible assignment: create European Renaissance gardens in a landscape that rejected every principle of European garden design. The Italian gardens that inspired Vizcaya were shaped by Mediterranean climate with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. Plants went dormant in predictable cycles. Growth was controlled. Stone and water aged gracefully. Florida offered none of these conditions. Rain fell torrentially. Plants grew aggressively year-round. Humidity attacked stone and metal. The very concept of formal gardens seemed incompatible with subtropical reality. Suarez had trained at Villa La Pietra in Florence, studying under conditions where Italian Renaissance garden principles had evolved over centuries. He understood the vocabulary: parterres arranged in geometric patterns, fountains as focal points, sculpture integrated with architecture, sightlines creating visual relationships between elements. But understanding the language didn't mean it could be spoken in Florida. The first challenge was conceptual. European gardens expressed human control over nature through rigid geometry imposed on landscape. Plants were clipped into unnatural shapes. Water was channeled into formal fountains and reflecting pools. Stone pathways and walls created clear boundaries between cultivated and wild. Florida's exuberant growth mocked such control. Leave a garden unattended for a few weeks, and the jungle would reclaim it. Suarez's response was strategic compromise. The gardens would be rigorously formal near the house, gradually becoming less controlled as they extended away from architecture. This created zones of different character. The immediate terraces and parterres closest to Vizcaya would be purely European in appearance and maintenance. Further gardens would incorporate more tropical elements while maintaining formal structure. The outermost areas would transition to managed wilderness, acknowledging that total control was neither possible nor desirable. The plant selection required creativity bordering on desperation. Traditional Italian garden plants, boxwood for parterres, roses for color, classical Mediterranean herbs, simply couldn't survive Florida's climate. Suarez needed tropical plants that could be shaped to suggest European precedent. He found jasmine that could be trained like Italian hedges. Native palms that, carefully selected and placed, provided vertical elements similar to Italian cypress. Tropical flowering plants that, properly controlled, offered color without overwhelming the formal geometry. The challenge was maintenance. European gardens in Mediterranean climate required regular but manageable care. Florida gardens demanded constant vigilance. Plants that grew slowly in Italy grew explosively in Miami's heat and rain. A boxwood hedge in Florence might be trimmed 3 or 4 times annually. Its jasmine substitute in Miami needed attention every few weeks, or it would escape all geometric control. Suarez was designing gardens that would require armies of gardeners working continuously just to maintain the illusion of European formality. Water elements were central to Suarez's design, but Florida's humidity created problems unknown in Italy. Standing water bred mosquitoes. Fountains and pools needed constant circulation and treatment to prevent algae that would turn formal reflecting pools into green swamps. The plumbing systems were more complex than European precedent required, with pumps and filtration that Italian gardens had never needed. The garden mound became a focal point, an artificial hill that provided viewing perspectives and created the illusion of more varied topography. The flat South Florida landscape lacked the natural elevation changes Italian gardens exploited. Suarez had to create three-dimensional interest through construction rather than working with existing terrain. The mound required massive amounts of fill, structural support to prevent erosion, and planting that would stabilize the artificial hill while maintaining visual effect. Stone elements throughout the gardens combined authentic European pieces with new work carved to match. Balusters, urns, sculpture, architectural fragments salvaged from European estates were integrated with coral stone cut locally. The weathering patterns were different. European limestone aged differently than Florida coral rock, but careful placement and planting helped disguise the differences. The goal was making gardens that felt centuries old, rather than brand new. The secret garden exemplified Suarez's approach, an enclosed space with intimate scale, dense planting creating shelter, stone and water elements providing focal points. The geometry was formal, paths and plantings arranged with Renaissance precision. But the plants themselves were largely tropical, selected for their ability to survive while being shaped to European effect. The result was a space that felt European while being fundamentally adapted to its actual location. The casino, a pavilion at the garden's edge, served as destination and entertaining space. Italian gardens traditionally included such structures where owners could retreat from the main house while remaining within the estate's designed landscape. Vizcaya's casino provided similar function, but needed to withstand hurricane winds and tropical storms that Italian pavilions never faced. The structure was reinforced concrete, disguised as traditional masonry, another example of modern technology hidden behind historical appearance. The relationship between gardens and bay required particular attention. European villas typically sat within completely controlled landscape. Vizcaya's waterfront meant wild nature was immediately adjacent to formal gardens. Suarez used the shoreline as deliberate contrast, formal gardens ending at the seawall with Biscayne Bay beyond providing uncontrolled natural beauty. The juxtaposition enhanced both elements, each made more striking by proximity to its opposite. Planting maturity was essential to the effect James wanted. Newly planted gardens look raw and unfinished. Italian villas had gardens that had evolved over generations. Suarez needed to suggest similar age immediately. He specified mature trees wherever possible, substantial specimens transplanted with difficulty but providing instant maturity. Fast-growing tropical plants were used strategically, knowing they would quickly create density even if long-term maintenance would be challenging. The formal parterres near the house were perhaps Suarez's greatest challenge. These geometric planting beds, fundamental to Italian garden design, required plants that could be shaped into precise patterns and maintained consistently. The substitutes he found worked visually, but demanded far more maintenance than their European counterparts. Keeping parterres looking crisp in Florida's climate was a never-ending battle against aggressive tropical growth. Sculpture throughout the gardens was carefully placed to create visual relationships and guide movement through the designed landscape. Some pieces were genuine European antiques. Others were carved specifically for Vizcaya, new work executed in traditional styles. The placement followed Renaissance principles about sightlines and focal points, but had to account for different light quality and vegetation density than Italian precedent assumed. By the early 1920s, when the gardens were substantially complete, Suarez had achieved something remarkable. Vizcaya's gardens looked European. Visitors with knowledge of Italian villa gardens recognized the vocabulary and appreciated the authenticity. Yet these gardens functioned in tropical conditions that should have made such design impossible. The achievement required constant maintenance at levels far exceeding what European gardens demanded, but the visual effect succeeded completely. The gardens ultimately cost nearly as much as the house itself, reflecting the difficulty of imposing European formality on tropical landscape. James Deering had resources to sustain the necessary maintenance, but the long-term question was whether anyone else would. After his death, the gardens would face challenges that threatened their survival, as maintenance costs and hurricane damage tested whether Suarez's compromise between European design and Florida reality could endure. For the years James enjoyed Vizcaya, the gardens provided exactly what he'd envisioned: European beauty and formality transported to a tropical setting. The impossible had been achieved through Suarez's skill, massive resources, and acceptance that maintaining the illusion would require permanent effort at extraordinary expense. The Stone Barge, Vizcaya's iconic breakwater. Rising from Biscayne Bay just offshore from Vizcaya's East Terrace stands one of the most unusual architectural features ever created for an American estate. A massive stone sculpture shaped like a Renaissance ship, serving simultaneously as breakwater, viewing platform, and pure artistic statement. The stone barge, as it came to be known, solved a practical problem while creating an unforgettable visual element. Vizcaya's waterfront location offered spectacular bay views, but exposed the property to waves and storm surge. A conventional concrete breakwater would have protected the shoreline, but violated every aesthetic principle James Deering and his team held. If Vizcaya needed coastal protection, that protection would be transformed into art. The concept evolved through collaboration between Chalfin, Hoffman, and Suarez. They envisioned a sculptural breakwater designed as a fantastical ship, a caravel suggesting the age of exploration when Spanish vessels had first reached Florida's shores. The structure would break wave energy before it reached the seawall, protecting both the terrace and the formal gardens from salt spray and storm damage. The design was audacious. The stone barge would be substantial enough to withstand hurricanes, positioned in the bay with its bow facing southeast to intercept prevailing winds and waves. But rather than appearing defensive or industrial, it would be ornamental, carved and decorated like a Renaissance galley, populated with figures and details that rewarded close observation. Construction of the stone barge required solving unprecedented technical challenges. The structure needed foundations in the bay floor stable enough to resist storm forces. The weight would be enormous, hundreds of tons of stone, concrete, and fill. Building it required creating temporary work platforms in the water, transporting materials by boat, and executing carved stone details in the hostile environment of sun, salt, and humidity. The sculptor Alexander Sterling Calder was commissioned to create figures for the barge. Calder, father of the more famous Alexander Calder, who would later revolutionize modern sculpture, was an established artist whose work combined classical training with imaginative freedom. For Vizcaya, he created figures that were fantastical rather than realistic, suggesting mythological creatures and explorers rather than attempting historical accuracy. The stone barge's form was elongated, approximately 160 feet long, shaped to suggest a ship's hull. The bow rose dramatically, carved with details suggesting Baroque ornamentation. The stern featured a pavilion-like structure, columns supporting a decorated roof. The entire composition was executed in coral stone, the same material used throughout Vizcaya's architecture, creating visual unity between house and barge. The figures Calder created populate the barge like a frozen crew. Some suggest sailors or explorers. Others are purely fantastical hybrid creatures that blend human and marine elements. The carvings weren't meant to be precisely readable from the house. They were mysterious, details that revealed themselves gradually as viewers moved along the terrace or, more adventurously, took boats to examine the barge up close. The positioning was calculated precisely, too close to shore, and the barge wouldn't effectively break waves. Too far, and it would lose visual connection to the house. The final location created perfect balance, close enough to feel part of Vizcaya's designed landscape, distant enough to maintain independent presence as a sculptural object in the bay. The engineering was hidden but sophisticated. Concrete foundations extended deep into the bay floor. The stone elements were secured with reinforcing that couldn't be seen, but ensured the structure could survive hurricane forces. The whole was designed to allow water to flow through and around it, rather than presenting a solid barrier, reducing the forces the structure needed to withstand while effectively breaking wave energy. When completed, the stone barge created exactly the effect Chalfin and Deering had envisioned. From the house, it appeared as a fantastic ship permanently anchored in the bay, a sculptural folly that suggested wealth so extravagant it could populate the ocean with stone vessels. From the bay, approaching by boat as James often did, it announced Vizcaya spectacularly, an impossible object that signaled the estate's commitment to beauty without compromise. The barge also served practical functions beyond wave protection. It created a sheltered area of water between itself and the shore, making it easier to dock boats at Vizcaya's waterfront. James, who owned multiple yachts and loved sailing, benefited from this protected mooring area. The barge made Vizcaya more accessible from the water, important in an era when arriving by yacht was how wealthy visitors often traveled. The stone barge became one of Vizcaya's most photographed features, instantly recognizable and impossible to replicate. Other estates might have formal gardens or Italianate architecture, but no one else had a stone ship permanently moored in their bay. It was pure James Deering, practical need, transformed into artistic statement through unlimited resources and sophisticated taste. The barge also reflected the playfulness that Vizcaya embodied despite its serious architectural pedigree. This was a Renaissance palazzo, yes, but one built by a bachelor who could indulge whimsical ideas. The stone barge had no historical precedent. It was pure invention, a fantasy that succeeded because everyone involved believed that beautiful impossibilities were worth creating. Over the decades, the stone barge would prove its practical value repeatedly. Hurricanes that damaged Vizcaya's gardens and buildings left the barge standing, testament to the engineering hidden within its artistic form. The stone carving weathered better than anyone might have expected, coral stone proving surprisingly durable in saltwater environment. The structure that seemed most vulnerable, most extravagant, most purely decorative, was actually among Vizcaya's most successful elements. The barge also created a visual relationship between Vizcaya and Biscayne Bay that was unique among American estates. Most waterfront properties treated water as backdrop or amenity. Vizcaya treated the bay as part of its designed landscape, an element to be shaped and decorated like the gardens. The stone barge extended Vizcaya's architecture into the water, claiming the bay as part of the estate's artistic territory. For James, the barge represented everything he'd tried to achieve at Vizcaya. It was beautiful without apology. It served practical purposes while being primarily artistic. It demonstrated that unlimited resources combined with educated taste could create objects that had never existed before. And it was permanent, built to outlast storms and time, ensuring that Vizcaya would be remembered for something genuinely unique. Today, the stone barge remains one of Vizcaya's most beloved features, appearing in countless photographs and serving as an instantly recognizable symbol of the estate. Its survival through hurricanes and decades of neglect during Vizcaya's difficult mid-century years prove that extravagant artistic gestures, properly engineered, can be as durable as more conventional architecture. The stone barge stands as evidence that James Deering's vision for Vizcaya was never about practical necessity. It was about creating beauty that enriched life and defied expectations. In a bay where practical men would have built concrete breakwaters, James and his team created a Renaissance ship in stone because beauty mattered more than economy, and imagination was worth any cost. The interiors, European splendor in the tropics. Step through Vizcaya's entrance and the tropical heat disappears, replaced by the cool dimness of rooms that could have been transplanted intact from an Italian palazzo. This was exactly what James Deering and Paul Chalfin intended, interiors so authentically European that visitors would forget they stood in Florida. The entrance hall set the tone immediately. Rising 2 stories with a grand staircase as focal point, the space announced that Vizcaya was serious architecture, not a casual beach house. The stair was marble, its balustrade carved stone with iron details. The walls were faced with European stone, some salvaged from actual Renaissance buildings. The ceiling program combined structural beams with decorative painting, executed by craftsmen working in traditional techniques. Chalfin's genius was in orchestrating dozens of elements so they felt inevitable rather than assembled. Each room had architectural character that seemed to have evolved over time. Walls with historic paneling, ceilings with period decoration, floors using antique materials, windows and doors incorporating salvaged elements. New work was executed to match old, using traditional materials and techniques, so the seams between historic and new became invisible. The East Loggia exemplified Vizcaya's success in adapting European design to Florida function. This room, opening to the bay through arched openings, was neither fully interior nor exterior. Italian loggias provided shaded outdoor space in Mediterranean climate. Florida's humidity and insects made such spaces problematic. Vizcaya's loggia compromised, architecturally open but with screens that could be deployed when needed, allowing circulation while providing protection. The result felt authentically Italian while functioning in tropical reality. The reception rooms demonstrated different approaches to creating European atmosphere. The Renaissance hall used dark wood paneling and elaborate ceiling beams to suggest 16th century Italian precedent. The room felt masculine and somewhat severe, appropriate for formal receiving. The furniture was authentic Renaissance and Baroque pieces, selected for both quality and scale appropriate to the space. The music room offered contrast, lighter in tone, with painted decoration and more delicate furnishings. This was a space for entertainment and social gathering, decorated to feel festive rather than imposing. The ceiling featured Rococo painting, cherubs, and clouds creating illusion of opening to sky. The color palette was softer, gilding and pastel tones replacing the darker materials of more formal spaces. The dining room balanced formality with warmth. Large enough to seat substantial dinner parties, it avoided the cavernous feeling that could make such spaces uncomfortable. Wood paneling and a massive fireplace created architectural character. The ceiling was coffered, painted decoration within the geometric framework. The furniture was primarily 18th century pieces, selected for comfortable scale rather than maximum grandeur. James's private spaces on the upper floors were more intimate but equally refined. His bedroom was relatively modest by palazzo standards, decorated with restraint that suggested personal taste rather than display. The bathroom, however, was extraordinary, marble throughout, with fixtures that combined modern plumbing with period-appropriate design. A ceiling painting of mythological scenes turned a functional space into an artistic environment. The library was one of Vizcaya's most successful rooms, combining function with beauty seamlessly. Floor-to-ceiling bookcases held James's collection. A large desk provided workspace. Comfortable seating created areas for reading, but the room was also architecturally distinguished, with a decorated ceiling and carefully chosen materials that made it feel like a European scholar's retreat. This was a room meant for use, not just display, and it succeeded in both purposes. Throughout the house, Chalfin had placed objects from his and James's collecting expeditions. Ceramics, sculpture, paintings, textiles, decorative arts of every description. These weren't simply scattered as decoration. Each piece was positioned where it enhanced the room's character while being displayed to advantage. Vizcaya functioned as a private museum, housing a significant collection while remaining a comfortable residence. The integration of modern building systems was nearly invisible. Electrical wiring ran hidden in walls. Light fixtures were designed or adapted from period examples to provide illumination while maintaining historical appearance. Radiators for the heating system were concealed behind decorative grills. Bathrooms featured modern plumbing but with fixtures styled to match the room's periods. Vizcaya had 20th century convenience within 16th through 18th century aesthetic. The servant spaces, tucked away on upper floors and in the basement, were far more utilitarian. Kitchen, laundry, storage, staff quarters. These spaces were designed for efficiency rather than display. The contrast was stark. The division between spaces for family and guests versus spaces for staff reflected the social hierarchies of early 20th century American wealth. Vizcaya's beauty was built on invisible labor, servants maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. The courtyard, open to sky, provided the Mediterranean touch essential to Italian villa design. This central space allowed light deep into the building while creating outdoor living area protected from wind and public view. Fountains provided sound and visual focus. Plantings brought nature into architecture. The courtyard made Vizcaya feel like a proper Renaissance villa, rather than simply a large house styled in historical manner. The quality of craftsmanship throughout was extraordinary. Door and window hardware was custom designed and cast in bronze. Plasterwork was hand-executed by master craftsmen. Stone carving met museum quality standards. Woodwork demonstrated skills that were already becoming rare in an era of industrial production. Vizcaya represented possibly the last moment when such comprehensive traditional craftsmanship could be assembled for a private residence. Color throughout was more varied and intense than typical American houses of the period. Deep reds, golds, rich greens, colors that would have felt authentic in Mediterranean light, worked surprisingly well in Florida. Chalfin understood that color could make spaces feel more intimate or more grand depending on application, and he used it strategically throughout the house. The result of Chalfin's orchestration and James's patronage was a house that felt genuinely old despite being newly built. Visitors couldn't easily distinguish between antique architectural elements and new work executed in traditional styles. The interiors achieved the patina of age, the sense of accumulated history that James had wanted. Vizcaya didn't look like a rich man's new house. It looked like a Renaissance villa that had somehow found itself transplanted to Florida's shore. For the few years James enjoyed Vizcaya fully, the interiors provided exactly the environment he'd envisioned. European sophistication in tropical setting, historical beauty combined with modern comfort, a house that honored the past while being fully of its moment. The interiors were Vizcaya's greatest achievement, proof that American wealth and European culture could be synthesized into something genuinely extraordinary. A bachelor's paradise, life at Vizcaya. James Deering finally had what he'd spent years creating: a Renaissance palazzo on Biscayne Bay, gardens that suggested centuries of cultivation, and the freedom to live exactly as he chose. For a wealthy bachelor in his late 50s, Vizcaya offered something rare: a complete artistic environment shaped entirely by personal vision without compromise to family expectations or social obligation. The daily rhythms at Vizcaya reflected James's particular temperament and interests. He was not a man who filled his days with constant social activity. Long periods were spent simply enjoying the house and gardens, reading in the library, walking the terraces, observing the bay. Vizcaya was designed for contemplation as much as entertainment, spaces that rewarded quiet appreciation rather than demanding constant activity. When James was in residence, typically from late fall through early spring, the house operated with a permanent staff of approximately 30. This included household servants, gardeners, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, and various specialists required to maintain a property of Vizcaya's complexity. The staff lived either in the house itself or in the village compound, the collection of service buildings that made the estate largely self-sufficient. The relationship between James and his staff was formal by contemporary standards, but relatively enlightened for the period. He paid well and provided decent working conditions. Many staff members remained with him for years, suggesting that Vizcaya was a desirable place to work despite the demanding standards. The social distance between employer and employees was absolute, reflecting the hierarchies of the era, but James apparently treated staff with respect, if not familiarity. Paul Chalfin remained intimately involved in Vizcaya's life long after construction was complete. He visited frequently, staying sometimes for extended periods. The relationship between James and Chalfin was complex and close, going beyond the professional to something approaching family. For James, a bachelor without wife or children, Chalfin's companionship filled needs that might otherwise have gone unmet. For Chalfin, James represented both patron and friend, someone who shared his aesthetic values and provided the resources to live at standards few could match. Entertaining at Vizcaya was selective rather than constant. James hosted dinners, garden parties, and occasional larger gatherings, but he was not trying to establish social dominance in the manner of Newport's competing millionaires. The guest lists reflected personal friendship and cultural interests more than social calculation. Artists, writers, musicians, cultivated individuals who could appreciate Vizcaya and contribute to interesting conversation. These were James's preferred guests. The house supported entertainment beautifully. The dining room could accommodate substantial dinner parties. The music room provided perfect setting for concerts and performances. The gardens offered venues for outdoor entertaining, from intimate gatherings on terraces to larger parties utilizing the lawns and pathways. But Vizcaya never became a stage for social competition. James had built it for himself, and entertaining was pleasure rather than obligation. His yachts, particularly the Nepenthe, extended Vizcaya's lifestyle onto the water. James loved sailing, and Biscayne Bay offered perfect conditions. The stone barge provided protected mooring where boats could dock conveniently. Many of James's best days at Vizcaya involved simply being on the water, enjoying the physical beauty of the bay and the freedom that sailing represented. The relationship between Vizcaya and Miami remained somewhat distant. James was not particularly interested in civic affairs or local society. He'd come to Miami because the climate suited his health and the location offered land where he could build without constraint. But he didn't attempt to dominate Miami society or become a civic leader. Vizcaya existed somewhat apart, a private world that happened to be located near a growing city rather than truly part of that city. James's health, the original reason for coming to Florida, was never fully restored. Pernicious anemia was manageable, but not curable with the medical knowledge of the period. He required ongoing treatment and monitoring. The warm climate helped, and Vizcaya's comfortable environment made daily life easier than Chicago winters would have allowed. But James knew his time was likely limited, which perhaps contributed to his determination to complete Vizcaya and enjoy it while he could. The bachelor lifestyle Vizcaya supported was unusual for its time. Wealthy men were expected to marry, establish families, create dynasties. James had chosen differently, whether by preference or circumstance. Vizcaya represented an alternative vision of what wealth could support, a life focused on aesthetic achievement and personal satisfaction rather than family and dynasty building. Some contemporaries surely speculated about James's bachelor status and his close relationship with Chalfin. The nature of their friendship remains somewhat opaque to historical analysis, as was common for such relationships in that era. What's clear is that they shared genuine affection and trust, that their collaboration on Vizcaya was central to both their lives, and that the house represented their joint achievement in ways that transcended conventional client-architect relationships. Vizcaya included spaces designed specifically to encourage visits from James's nieces and nephews, the children of his siblings. A bowling alley, tennis courts, a swimming pool that could be filled with either fresh or salt water. These recreational amenities suggested James hoped the younger generation would enjoy Vizcaya. He had no direct heirs, but he wanted the house to have future life beyond his own years. The daily pleasure of living at Vizcaya came from the environment itself more than from elaborate activities. Walking the gardens in early morning, watching light change on the bay through the afternoon, reading in the library, examining objects in the collection. These simple activities were enriched by the extraordinary setting James and his team had created. Every glance revealed something beautiful, carefully chosen or created to meet the highest standards. As James entered his 60s, he must have reflected on what he'd achieved. No children to inherit, no business legacy, he'd been a competent but not visionary executive at International Harvester. What remained was Vizcaya, evidence that he'd understood beauty, possessed sophisticated taste, and commanded resources sufficient to give physical form to aesthetic vision. For a man without conventional legacy through family or career, the house became his monument. The few years James enjoyed Vizcaya fully, from taking occupancy in late 1916 through the early 1920s, represented the fulfillment of everything he'd worked toward. The house functioned exactly as intended. The gardens matured beautifully. The art and furnishings created the atmosphere he'd envisioned. Vizcaya had succeeded completely as an artistic achievement and as a place to live. But time was running short. James's health was declining despite the favorable climate and comfortable surroundings. The project that had consumed the last 15 years of his life, from initial planning through completion, was finished. He could enjoy what he'd created, but the creative process itself was over. What remained was to live in and appreciate the extraordinary environment he and his collaborators had brought into existence. The Brief Glory, Deering's Final Years and Death. By the early 1920s, Vizcaya was complete. The house functioned perfectly. The gardens had matured. The art collection was installed. James Deering, now in his 60s, could finally enjoy what 15 years of planning and construction had created. But time was running out faster than anyone anticipated. James's health, never robust since his pernicious anemia diagnosis, was declining despite Florida's favorable climate and Vizcaya's comfortable surroundings. The disease was manageable but not curable with early 20th century medicine. Treatment involved liver extracts and dietary management, primitive by later standards but the best available at the time. James received excellent medical care, but pernicious anemia remained a progressive condition. The winters at Vizcaya followed pleasant rhythms. James would arrive in late fall, typically November or December, and remain through early spring. The house operated smoothly with its trained staff. Daily life combined relaxation with the activities James enjoyed. Reading, sailing, walking the gardens, examining objects in his collection. Entertaining was selective, dinners and gatherings for friends rather than obligations to society. Paul Chalfin remained a constant presence, visiting frequently and staying for extended periods. Their relationship had evolved over the 15 years of Vizcaya's creation, from professional collaboration to something deeper and more personal. For James, Chalfin provided companionship that filled needs a bachelor's life might otherwise lack. They shared aesthetic sensibilities, memories of European travels, and the satisfaction of having created something extraordinary together. The relationship between James and Chalfin has been the subject of speculation by historians. The nature of their friendship remains somewhat opaque, as was common for such relationships in that era. What's documented is genuine affection, close collaboration, and mutual dependence that transcended conventional professional boundaries. Vizcaya was their joint creation in ways that went beyond patron and designer. James's nieces and nephews visited occasionally, enjoying the recreational amenities he'd installed partly for their use. The bowling alley, tennis courts, and swimming pool saw more activity when younger family members were present. James had no children of his own, but he wanted Vizcaya to have intergenerational appeal, hoping the estate would remain meaningful to his extended family after his death. The pleasure James took in Vizcaya was evident to everyone who visited. He'd achieved something rare, creating an environment that perfectly expressed his taste and values. Every room, every view, every object reflected decisions he'd made or approved. This was the ultimate luxury for someone with his resources and sophistication, not just owning beautiful things, but inhabiting a complete artistic statement. But the accomplishment was bittersweet. James had spent so many years planning and building that the period of actual enjoyment was brief. From taking initial occupancy in late 1916 to his death in 1925, he had less than 9 years to live in the completed house. Much of that time was spent while construction continued on gardens and outbuildings. The period when everything was truly finished and functioning as intended was only a few years. The awareness that his time was limited must have colored James's experience of Vizcaya. He'd built for posterity, creating something designed to last centuries. Yet he would barely inhabit it. The house represented both achievement and loss, proof that he'd understood beauty and possessed means to give it form, but also a reminder that even extraordinary wealth couldn't buy time or health. In the summer of 1925, James was in Europe, likely seeking medical consultations or simply traveling as he'd done throughout his life. His health deteriorated seriously enough that he decided to return to America. He booked passage on the steamship SS City of Paris, departing from France for New York. The voyage proved fatal. On September 21, 1925, James Deering died aboard the ship while crossing the Atlantic. He was 65 years old. The exact circumstances of his death aren't fully documented, but pernicious anemia was almost certainly the underlying cause. His body was returned to America and buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, the city where he'd made his fortune and from which he'd escaped each winter to Vizcaya. The news of James's death shocked those who knew him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. His health problems were known to friends and family. But there's always something unexpected about death, even when it's been approaching gradually. James had seemed permanent somehow, like Vizcaya itself. The idea that the house would continue while its creator was gone required adjustment. James's will revealed his intentions for Vizcaya and his fortune. The estate passed to his nieces, Marion Deering McCormick and Barbara Deering Danielson, daughters of his half-brother Charles. Significant bequests went to institutions, hospitals, museums, educational organizations. The Art Institute of Chicago received important paintings from his collection. Various charities benefited from his philanthropic impulses. But the bulk of the estate, including Vizcaya, went to family. James had hoped they would maintain it, perhaps use it as he had, preserving what he'd created while making it part of their own lives. Whether this was realistic given the costs of maintaining such a property, he may not have fully considered. The annual expenses for operating Vizcaya were substantial, even for wealthy heirs. Paul Chalfin was devastated by James's death. He'd lost not just a patron, but his closest friend, and the person with whom he'd created his life's masterwork. Chalfin would remain connected to Vizcaya for years, advising James's heirs on maintenance and preservation. But the house without James was fundamentally different. The creative partnership that had made Vizcaya possible was ended. The irony of James's death was cruel. He'd built Vizcaya partly to have a healthy environment where he could live comfortably despite his medical condition. The house had succeeded in providing those years of relative comfort and pleasure, but ultimately the disease that brought him to Miami also took him away, dying not at Vizcaya, but in transit across the ocean, returning from yet another European journey. Vizcaya at the time of James's death was at its peak. The house was complete and beautifully maintained. The gardens were mature and functioning as Suarez had designed them. The staff was trained and efficient. Everything worked exactly as intended. It was a perfect machine for living beautifully, now without the person for whom it had been created. The brief glory of Vizcaya under James's ownership was over. Less than a decade of full enjoyment for a house that had taken 15 years to plan and build. The disproportion was striking, but perhaps that's the nature of great artistic achievements. They're created through long effort and survive beyond their creators, while the period of actual use by those who made them is fleeting. James Deering had achieved what he set out to do. He'd created a Renaissance villa in tropical Miami, demonstrating that sophisticated taste combined with sufficient resources could build something unprecedented. He'd given physical form to aesthetic vision developed through decades of European travel and study. He'd left a legacy that would outlast him by generations. But the cost was high. The years spent planning and building were years not spent simply living. The fortune invested in stone and art was fortune that might have served other purposes. And the brief period of enjoyment before death claimed him seemed almost cruel payment for such extraordinary effort. Vizcaya now faced an uncertain future. James's heirs would inherit both the property and the burden of maintaining it. The question was whether anyone else could value Vizcaya enough to preserve it as James had intended, or whether the house would gradually decline once the animating vision of its creator was gone. Abandonment, hurricanes, and decay. James's death left Vizcaya in limbo. His nieces, Marion Deering McCormick and Barbara Deering Danielson, inherited an extraordinary property but also an extraordinary burden. The house that had cost millions to build required ongoing substantial investment simply to maintain. Neither Marion nor Barbara lived at Vizcaya. They had their own homes and families. The estate was beautiful, historically significant, and valuable, but it wasn't really usable for them in the way it had been for James. A bachelor could make Vizcaya his winter retreat, organizing his life around seasonal residents. Married women with children and established households found the property impractical despite its grandeur. The economics of maintaining Vizcaya were daunting. The house required full-time staff even when unoccupied. Gardens needed constant attention to prevent tropical vegetation from reclaiming the formal plantings. The building systems, plumbing, electrical, heating required monitoring and maintenance. Property taxes on such valuable real estate were substantial. The annual costs ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars even in 1920s currency. For the first few years after James's death, the sisters attempted to maintain Vizcaya at something approaching its original standards. Paul Chalfin remained involved, providing advice and oversight. The staff continued their work. The gardens were tended. But without James's personal involvement and his willingness to spend freely on maintenance, small problems began accumulating. Then, in September 1926, less than a year after James's death, disaster struck. The Great Miami Hurricane, one of the most powerful storms to hit South Florida, devastated the region. Vizcaya, exposed on Biscayne Bay, took tremendous damage. The stone barge, designed as a breakwater, proved its worth by protecting the house from the worst storm surge. But the gardens were destroyed. The formal plantings Suarez had created, and James had maintained at enormous expense, were torn apart by wind and drowned by salt water. The tea house that had stood on the stone barge was swept away entirely. Trees were uprooted. Architectural elements in the gardens were damaged or destroyed. The gazebo that had crowned the barge disappeared. The destruction was comprehensive. The cost of repairing the hurricane damage was staggering. Paul Chalfin was brought back to oversee restoration work. But the sisters faced hard decisions about how much to invest in a property they didn't occupy and couldn't easily sell. They authorized significant repairs to the house itself and basic stabilization of the gardens, but full restoration to pre-hurricane condition was financially impossible. The hurricane damage marked a turning point. Before the storm, there was hope that Vizcaya might continue functioning essentially as James had left it. After the storm, that illusion was shattered. The property would never again achieve the perfection it had known in James's final years. The question became not whether Vizcaya would decline, but how fast and how far. Through the late 1920s and 1930s, the sisters made periodic visits but spent little time there. The house stood mostly empty, maintained by reduced staff who did their best with limited resources. The gardens, once the equal of the architecture, grew increasingly wild as tropical vegetation exploited any weakness in maintenance. The formerly crisp parterres became overgrown. Fountains fell silent. Paths disappeared under aggressive growth. The Great Depression added economic pressure to the already difficult situation. The sisters' own fortunes were affected by the stock market crash and subsequent economic collapse. Maintaining Vizcaya became even more financially burdensome. They began selling off portions of the property, reducing the original 180 acres to something more manageable, but destroying the estate's original boundaries and context. In 1945, the sisters sold substantial acreage to the Catholic diocese for development of Mercy Hospital. This transaction brought necessary capital, but permanently altered Vizcaya's setting. The hospital construction meant urban development pressing close to what had been designed as an isolated estate. The sense of removal from Miami that James had carefully preserved was compromised. Additional hurricanes through the 1940s and 50s caused further damage. Each storm required repairs that the sisters were increasingly reluctant or unable to fund. The house remained structurally sound, testament to Hoffman's engineering and the quality of original construction. But the interiors showed neglect. The gardens continued declining. Vizcaya was sliding toward ruin. The sisters aged, and with age came decreased ability to manage the property, even at the minimal level they'd maintained. By the early 1950s, they faced a decision that had been approaching for years: what to do with Vizcaya. They couldn't maintain it. They couldn't find a private buyer willing to take on such a burdensome property. Demolition would be tragic, but might be the only economically rational choice. The condition of Vizcaya by 1952 was sobering. The house needed extensive restoration. The gardens required comprehensive replanting and repair. Building systems were outdated or failing. The property as a whole represented a preservation challenge that would require millions of dollars and years of work to address properly. Yet the bones were still there. Hoffman's architecture remained sound. Hunt's decorative programs, while damaged, were largely intact. The gardens, though overgrown, retained their basic structure. Enough survived that restoration was possible, if someone with resources and commitment could be found. The sisters eventually made a decision that saved Vizcaya from demolition, but couldn't save it for private use. In 1952, they sold the house, formal gardens, and 50 remaining acres to Miami-Dade County for $1 million. Far below the property's actual value, but more than they could have obtained from any private buyer. The sale included James's furnishings and art collection, donated to ensure they stayed with the house. The purchase price seems shockingly low. $1 million for a property that had cost over $15 million to build just 30 years earlier. But the economics made sense from the county's perspective. They were acquiring not just a house, but an enormous preservation obligation. The $1 million was just the beginning of what would need to be spent to make Vizcaya viable as a public museum. Vizcaya had survived, but it had been transformed. The private bachelor's paradise that James had created was now public property, soon to become a museum where visitors would pay admission to see how a millionaire had lived. The intimate spaces where James had read and entertained would host school groups and tourists. The gardens where he'd walked alone would be traversed by crowds. The period from James's death in 1925 to the county purchase in 1952 represented Vizcaya's darkest years. The house had gone from perfection to abandonment, from meticulous maintenance to genteel decay, from private treasure to white elephant that no one quite knew how to handle. Only the determination that something so extraordinary deserved preservation kept Vizcaya from the demolition that claimed so many other Gilded Age estates. Preservation and legacy, saving the dream. Miami-Dade County's acquisition of Vizcaya in 1952 saved the property from demolition, but it created a new challenge: transforming a private estate into a public museum while preserving its character and addressing decades of deferred maintenance. The county opened Vizcaya as the Dade County Art Museum in 1953, barely a year after purchase. The speed of opening reflected both enthusiasm for the project and limited resources for proper restoration before welcoming visitors. The house was cleaned and stabilized, but comprehensive restoration would take decades and millions of dollars the county didn't initially have. Early visitors to the museum saw Vizcaya in a state James would hardly have recognized. The interiors retained their basic character, but finishes were deteriorated. The gardens were overgrown, formal plantings overtaken by tropical vegetation. The stone barge showed weather damage and erosion. Everything needed work that would require sustained commitment and substantial funding. The challenge of maintaining European architecture in tropical climate became increasingly apparent. Materials that survived well in Mediterranean conditions deteriorated rapidly in Miami's humidity and salt air. Stone carved by Calder eroded, plasterwork crumbled, wood rotted, metal corroded. Every element required more frequent maintenance than similar buildings in temperate climates would demand. Hurricane damage continued to be a recurring threat. The 1960 hurricane season brought flooding. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 caused extensive damage to gardens and buildings. Hurricane Irma in 2017 produced unprecedented storm surge that inundated portions of the property. Each storm required emergency repairs and raised questions about long-term viability of preserving European-style architecture in such a vulnerable location. But Vizcaya also benefited from growing appreciation for historic preservation and architectural heritage. In 1994, the estate was designated a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of recognition for historically significant properties. This designation brought prestige and helped attract funding, but it also imposed strict requirements for any restoration or modification work. The National Trust for Historic Preservation listed Vizcaya as one of America's 11 most endangered historic places in 2008, drawing attention to threats from proposed high-rise development on neighboring properties and ongoing vulnerability to hurricanes and sea level rise. The designation helped mobilize support, but also highlighted how precarious Vizcaya's situation remained. Funding for restoration and maintenance came from multiple sources. Miami-Dade County provided basic operational support, but it was never sufficient for comprehensive preservation needs. Federal grants through programs like Save America's Treasures contributed to specific projects. Private donors, including descendants of the Deering family, supported conservation work. The Vizcaya Museum and Gardens Trust, established in 1998, took on responsibility for fundraising and advocacy. Major restoration projects addressed the most critical needs. The stone barge underwent stabilization to prevent further erosion of Calder's sculptures. The original carved figures were eventually removed and replaced with replicas, preserving the originals in controlled storage while maintaining the barge's appearance. Interior restoration focused on rooms with the most significant decorative programs, carefully conserving Chalfon's vision while making spaces functional for museum use. The gardens presented particular challenges. Suarez's original design required intensive maintenance that museum budgets struggled to support. Tropical climate meant constant battle against aggressive vegetation. The decision was made to maintain the gardens in a way that suggested their original character without attempting to achieve the perfection James had demanded. This compromise preserved the basic design while acknowledging practical limitations. Climate change added new urgency to preservation challenges. Rising sea levels threaten Vizcaya's waterfront location. More intense storms test the property's resilience. The stone barge, which survived a century of hurricanes, faces increased stress from more frequent and severe weather events. Long-term preservation may require adaptation strategies that James and his designers never anticipated. Technology has provided new tools for preservation. Three-dimensional scanning documented the stone barge in unprecedented detail, creating digital records that will guide future restoration even if physical elements continue deteriorating. Virtual reality allows visitors to experience spaces too fragile for public access. Digital archives preserve documentation that helps understand original design intent. Vizcaya's function as a museum has evolved over decades. Initially presented primarily as a house museum showing how a wealthy collector lived, interpretation has expanded to include the labor that made such estates possible, the environmental challenges of building in tropical climate, and the complex social dynamics of Gilded Age wealth. The story told is richer and more complete than simply celebrating James Deering's achievement. The estate now attracts over 200,000 visitors annually, making it one of Miami's most popular cultural attractions. School groups study architecture and history. Scholars research decorative arts and landscape design. Tourists photograph the stone barge and gardens. Special events, from concerts to weddings, generate revenue that supports preservation while making Vizcaya relevant to contemporary audiences. Yet tension remains between preservation and use. Every visitor causes incremental wear. Every event risks damage to fragile finishes. Every adaptation to make the museum functional compromises original design in small ways. Managing these conflicts requires constant negotiation between competing values: preservation, education, accessibility, financial sustainability. The legacy of Vizcaya extends beyond the physical property. The estate influenced how Americans think about architecture, demonstrating that European aesthetic could be adapted to New World conditions. It showed that serious art collecting and patronage could happen in unlikely places. It proved that preservation, however difficult and expensive, can save irreplaceable cultural heritage. For Miami specifically, Vizcaya represents cultural legitimacy that the city long craved. This wasn't a frontier town or tourist trap. This was a place that had attracted sophisticated wealth and supported world-class architecture. Vizcaya gave Miami cultural credentials that helped the city's self-image even as it grew into a major metropolitan area. James Deering's dream of creating a Renaissance villa in tropical paradise succeeded beyond what he could have imagined. He'd hoped Vizcaya would outlast him, and it has, by a century so far. He'd wanted to create beauty that would enrich life, and it continues to do so, though for thousands of public visitors rather than one private bachelor. The preservation of Vizcaya demonstrates what's possible when communities commit to protecting cultural heritage. The house should have been demolished decades ago. The economics never made sense. The challenges were enormous. But enough people believed that something so extraordinary deserved saving, and through sustained effort and investment, Vizcaya survived. The estate stands today not as James left it. That perfection was lost decades ago, but as something perhaps more meaningful. Evidence that beauty matters enough to fight for, that cultural heritage deserves protection even when expensive and difficult, and that the dreams of one wealthy bachelor can, with care and commitment, enrich generations he never knew. Vizcaya's future remains uncertain. Climate change, financial constraints, and the simple passage of time all threaten its survival. But for now, the castle by the bay endures. James Deering's impossible vision made real and preserved against considerable odds. A Renaissance palazzo in tropical Miami that shouldn't exist but does. Testament to what human ambition, taste, and resources can achieve when brought together with vision and determination. 1914. A wealthy bachelor with a health condition decides to build an Italian villa in Miami's wilderness. The idea seemed absurd by any practical measure, yet 8 years later, Vizcaya stood complete. A Renaissance palazzo that shouldn't have been possible, created through vision, resources, and the determination that beauty matters more than practicality. James Deering enjoyed his creation for barely 5 years before death claimed him aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic. The disproportion is striking: 15 years of planning and building for less than a decade of actual use. But perhaps that's the nature of great artistic achievements. They consume their creators' time and resources, survive beyond their makers, and ultimately serve purposes their originators never imagined. Vizcaya has outlasted James by a century. The house has weathered hurricanes that destroyed lesser buildings. It survived decades of neglect when no one knew quite what to do with a Renaissance villa in tropical Miami. It endured the transformation from private paradise to public museum, from intimate bachelor's retreat to tourist destination, hosting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The estate James created tells multiple stories. It's a story about wealth and what money can achieve when combined with educated taste. It's about the collision between European aesthetic and American ambition played out in coral stone and tropical plantings on Biscayne Bay. It's about one man's determination to create beauty without compromise, regardless of logic or location. But Vizcaya also tells darker stories, about the privilege that allowed one person to command 10% of Miami's population to build his private house. About the labor, much of it performed by black Bahamian workers, that made such estates possible. About the environmental audacity of imposing European formality on tropical landscape. about the unsustainability of lifestyles that required armies of servants and unlimited resources simply to maintain. The preservation of Vizcaya represents a choice Miami made about what matters. The house could have been demolished. The economics favored that outcome. But enough people believed that something so extraordinary deserved saving, despite the expense and difficulty. That choice says something about valuing beauty and cultural heritage even when they're burdensome. Paul Chalfin, James's closest collaborator, lived another 20 years after his friend's death. He remained connected to Vizcaya, advising on preservation and restoration, but the house without James must have felt incomplete. They'd created it together, their vision made physical through years of collaboration. Chalfin had lost not just a patron, but the person who'd shared and understood his aesthetic ambitions most completely. The stone barge still rises from Biscayne Bay, Calder's sculptures weathering but surviving, the breakwater continuing to protect the shore as designed. The formal gardens suggest their original splendor, despite the impossibility of maintaining them to James's standards. The interiors retain the character Chalfin created, though now traversed by tourists, rather than inhabited by a cultivated bachelor and his guests. Climate change threatens Vizcaya's future in ways James never imagined. Rising seas lap higher against the seawall. More intense hurricanes test the property's resilience. The tropical environment that attracted James for his health now threatens the architecture he built. Preservation becomes increasingly complex and expensive as conditions change. Yet Vizcaya endures. Not as James left it, that perfection was lost decades ago, but as something perhaps more valuable. Evidence that human creativity can produce extraordinary beauty, that cultural heritage deserves protection, and that communities can choose to preserve what matters even when easier to destroy. The bachelor who built Vizcaya left no children. His legacy isn't biological but architectural. The house stands as his monument, more eloquent than any descendant could be about who James Deering was and what he valued. Every visitor who walks the terraces, examines the interiors, or photographs the stone barge participates in keeping that legacy alive. Vizcaya Museum and Gardens now serves educational purposes James never intended but might have appreciated. Students learn about architecture, art, and history. Scholars research Gilded Age culture and decorative arts. The estate functions as classroom, laboratory, and inspiration for new generations discovering what's possible when vision meets resources. The question Vizcaya poses is timeless. What should we create, preserve, and value? James answered by building a Renaissance villa in an impossible location, spending a fortune to realize aesthetic vision. Miami answered by saving the house when demolition seemed inevitable. Each generation must answer anew, deciding whether Vizcaya's beauty justifies the ongoing commitment required for preservation. For now, the answer remains yes. The house stands, the gardens bloom, the stone barge breaks waves as it has for over a century. Visitors arrive, experience beauty that shouldn't exist in tropical Miami, and leave enriched by encountering James Deering's impossible dream made real. The castle by the sea endures. A Renaissance palazzo that defied logic, survived hurricanes and neglect, and continues to demonstrate that beauty matters, that vision can overcome obstacles, and that what one determined bachelor created to enrich his own life can, with proper care, enrich countless others who will never know him, but can appreciate what he built. James Deering's Vizcaya stands as evidence that the extraordinary is possible if we're willing to attempt it, that cultural treasures deserve protection even when burdensome, and that great architecture outlasts its creators to serve purposes they never imagined, but would, perhaps, have been pleased to see fulfilled.